what is the genesis of this book? How did you decide to write a book about the most famous museum in the world?
Well, usually in most years, though not this year, I go to Paris at some point in the summer, and I stay in a hotel right next to the Louvre. And I go to the Louvre every day except for Tuesday, because unfortunately Tuesday is the one day it's closed. And at one point I was going there, I was passing through the Jardin des Tuileries into the Louvre. And it occurred to me that I didn't quite understand exactly what I was looking at. So I began to research it just for my own personal satisfaction. And the interest that propelled me to do that grew upon itself. And at a certain point, I thought, I'd like to read a book that set forth the entire history of the Louvre, and I couldn't find one. So not for the first time in my career, I ended up writing the book I started out wanting to buy. And that's how this book came into being.
The book covers an enormous amount of ground, and we're not going to be able to go through all of it, obviously, today, but maybe you could tell us a little bit about the very early years of the Louvre, before it was a museum, before it was even a palace or a fortress. What was there in that space?
Okay, so as far as we know, it was pretty much open country for thousands of years. And this is going back before the Romans to 1000 BC. There was some cultivation going on there at various points. There were some vineyards in what is now the Place du Carrousel. When they were doing excavations on the Louvre in preparation for the Grand Louvre under Mitterrand, the 1980s, they discovered a skeleton of a woman from around 4,000 years ago. And it was also an area where they raised pigs and cattle of other sorts. This is going back 2,000-3,000 years.
But it was always known as, the space was always known as Le Louvre.
Yes, so the origin of the name Le Louvre, is mysterious. The structure that originally rose there was not known as the Louvre. It was this fortress placed in the area known as the Louvre, right? And it had that name going back at least to the 10th century, as far as we know.
So we don't know what it means. We don't know what the word
and we don't know what it means. It has defied all efforts to decipher it. A number of etymologies have been proposed, and they're all wrong. The most commonly encountered one is that it has something to do with the French word louve, which is a she-wolf. And it has been speculated that there were wolves in that part of Paris, or that dogs were bred in that part of Paris to fight the wolves that were in that part of Paris. That appears not to be the case, because if you look at the etymology of the word, it goes back to the 9th century, and I won't get into it too deeply. The etymology just doesn't line up with anything having to do with she-wolf. So
it's kind of nice that there's something about this enormous structure that we just can never know. There's something satisfying about that.
There are several things, I mean, that happened, in the mists of the Middle Ages, but there are things even more recently, which we'll get into, that happened in the full light of history, like who created the great east front of the Louvre, and we don't know for exactly who it was. So the Louvre still retains much of its mystery.
I don't know where you'd like to start with the history. There's certainly the medieval Louvre that we could talk about. Is that a good place to get into it?
Yes, that's a good idea. The Louvre, the initial efforts to create the Louvre were as part of a garrison, as part of a fortress on the western end of the wall that Philippe Auguste constructed around Paris, starting, I think, in 18 1190, 1189, 1190. If we can bring up the second image, the ground plan. I don't know if people can see it, but I can.
We have this.
The one after that, Okay,
Yeah.
so here, I'll just briefly mention what's going on here. It's hard to see, but what you're looking at in the larger gray area is the modern Cour Carrée. And in the southwest corner of it, you can see a darker area, which was the original Louvre and the original fortress. And that was originally exactly 1/4 of the what's now the Cour Carrée. And if you look at its northeasternmost extension, that's where you now find the fountain in the middle of the Cour Carrée. All right. So we can now dispense with that ugly image and go to the first image. Okay, there we go. This is, so it was originally a garrison, a fortress, which under Louis Philippe, under Philippe Auguste, the fortress began to be built around 1191, and was a rather ugly pedestrian piece of military infrastructure. But then around 200 years later, slightly under that, Charles V of France decided to convert it from a fortress into a palace. So what you see here is from the Les Très Riches du Duc de Berry by the Lambourg brothers from around 1414 or slightly earlier. This is an image of the Louvre as it was slightly after the reign of Charles V. And the building of this structure that you see here went on for a number of years after Charles V passed away. So this is really a very contemporary image of a building that had been completed probably 5 or 10 years before the artists depicted it. And this is, as far as we know, the earliest image of the Louvre. So it's from 1414, all right? And one of the reasons Charles V decided to convert it into a palace was that before then, all the kings of France, they pretty much, it was not a foregone conclusion that they would have anything to do with Paris. They didn't especially like Paris. It was the largest city in the kingdom, but they preferred to spend time outside of the city, and especially passing along a relay of palaces in other parts of the country administering justice. But at a certain point, he decided to spend a little more time in Paris. And usually the kings of France, when they were in Paris, they stayed on the Ile de la Cité. But because he had, it was a structure he didn't especially appreciate, he decided to move everything to the right bank of Paris. Okay. And that was, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I wanted to move us ahead a little bit because we have a lot of many centuries to cover. And maybe fast forward to the French Revolution. Where was the Louvre at that point? What was it? What kind of building?
Okay, so at that point it was technically a royal palace, but it had been taken over. The king, well, as of 1682, Louis XIV, after completing a lot of very excellent work on the Louvre, decided to move with his entire court to Versailles. So after that, after 1682, no king of France inhabited the Louvre ever again, except for a few months under Louis XV. While this was around 1720, and that was because a work was being done on the Tuileries Palace, which is where the kings of France usually stayed when they were in the city of Paris.
Okay, I think it's important for people to understand that the Louvre as we see it today is very, very different from the Louvre as it would have existed during this period, right? Can you tell us about some of, first of all, the Tuileries Palace was there. I think it might help if we bring up a photo. I'll bring it up in a minute. Could you kind of explain what the life was of this? It was not an austere space. There was a whole kind of village that occupied the courtyard of what we now know as the Louvre.
Well, first of all, would you do me a favor, Pamela, and bring up the image that you added of the map of the Louvre from around 1700? It's the one with the long building. Yeah, I'll get that. All right. So pardon the noise from outside. Okay, so this is an image of the Louvre as it existed sometime in the first third of the 17th century, so around 1630 or so. And you can see the Louvre, which is now in this picture, it's about a quarter of its present size. To the Louvre that we just discussed, the medieval palace, whose dimensions are shared by what you see here, there was added this enormous space called La Grande Galerie, which
and how long is La Grande Galerie? It's one of the largest. It helps make the Louvre one of the largest structures in the world. Do you say is it half a mile long or half a kilometer long?
The entire Louvre, from the easternmost point to the westernmost point, which you see here at the base of the image, that's about half a mile. The Grande Galerie, which is that long gallery on the right, that is about half a kilometer. Technically, you see various figures. It's 440, 460 meters, but it's basically half a kilometer. So
one thing that you mentioned in your book is that there was a period, and I don't know if this was between when the royals left the Louvre and it became a museum, where it was actually a sort of artist space, like a co-working space for artists of the period, and that actually a lot of the art that's in the Louvre was painted in the Louvre itself, thanks to these little studios. When was that period?
That's right. Okay, so after Louis XV, right, who reigned from 1715 to 1773 or 4, I think. After he left Paris under the Regency, by around 1720, the kings of France basically abandoned the Louvre for good. And if they ever came to Paris, they stayed in the Tuileries, which we should explain what that is at some point. And after he left, you had this enormous building, obviously, and very little role for it to play in any monarchical sense. So it became inhabited by the 5 learned societies of France, among them the Académie Française, the Académie de la Peinture et de l'Architecture, and so on, des Sciences. And you also had painters who were given spaces inside the Louvre, inside the Grande Galerie, and also inside what's now the Cour Carrée. So over time, you had people like Fragonard and Chardin and David and sculptors like Pigalle, all of whom inhabited the Louvre. And a lot of the present collection of the Louvre, insofar as it's French art from the 17th and 18th centuries, was created in the Louvre.
It's an amazing fact that the art was made to be hung on the walls of the museum itself.
Actually, can I just jump in real quick? While we're on the period of the French Revolution, James, I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about the notion of the Universal Museum, and not just sort of, sort of beyond, what's in the Louvre, but what it was always supposed to be about from the beginning. And I think that this is a super interesting development that's not distinctly French. The British Museum, I believe, is established in something like 1755, 1753, 55, although expanded in the early 19th century tremendously. But the notion that this is a radical legacy of the French Revolution because it is, in a former royal site that you've just explained, it's a museum that is meant to sort of illustrate and kind of present a narrative of, human inquiry, human achievement, but that also is not just universal, but is particular. And here we arrive at the sort of classic Frenchness quandary. So I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about the Louvre's universal ambitions and also how it relates to conceptions of French identity that were also radically altered after the French Revolution.
Okay, I shall do my best. So I think universality meant something slightly different in 1793 when the Louvre opened its doors as a public museum from what it meant about a generation later. I should start off by saying that although the Louvre opened in 1793, technically, the idea of opening such a museum in the Palace of the Louvre had been very much in the air for fully 40 years before then, but it just took its time because of the usual delays, foot dragging and everything like that. It didn't come to pass until 1793. And throughout Europe at this time, you had the rise of museums like the British Museum, the Uffizi, various princely collections that were open to the public. So this was really an age in which museums were, so to speak, percolating up all over the place in Western Europe. Now, when the people like the Comte d'Angeville, who was one of the main promoters of the idea of the Louvre as a museum, started to agitate for that result, the idea of universality meant mainly old master painting from Raphael and Michelangelo circa 1500 to the latest generation of the French and the Romans, the Italians, circa 1800 more or less. So that 300-year period. That was one realm of art that they cared about. The other realm was Greek and Roman art, which in practice meant only Roman art because at that point in the history of Western archaeology, one had seen very little that was actually from ancient Greece. So the universality of the Louvre, when it opened its doors in 1793, was European painting going back 300 years and whatever whatever Roman sculptures they could get their hands on. Right.
James, can I just clarify, when they were talking about, just for the audience, when they were talking about universality, the idea was that they would create a museum that contained all the great works of mankind throughout history. So it wasn't just a national museum like the British Museum or an Italian museum like the Uffizi. It was going to be a museum of the everything store of museums, kind of.
Exactly. Yeah. And then by 25 years later, a radical change had come upon Western culture in general, a kind of archaeological and ethnological revolution wherein people, Westerners, try to find out the most specific facts about former ages and distant cultures, right? So instead of having just European painting and Roman sculpture, you now wanted to get, by around 1820, let's say, you wanted to get actual Greek sculptures. Soon you would try to get sculptures from what we now know as former Assyria. You try to get work from the New World. You try to the medieval sculptures, the medieval works of art that in the throes of the French Reign of Terror, which coincided exactly with the opening of the Louvre, those works of art had been smashed to pieces pretty much simultaneously with the opening of the Louvre, right? But then a generation later, they gathered up all the shattered remains of that culture and carefully curated it and put it in the galleries of the Louvre. So that was a revolution in Westerners' views of their past. And it was at that point that it really started to become a universal museum.
But if I also just on that, I think you're absolutely right about the expansion of scope and time. But I think it's interesting to think about the museum as an institution, an institution with a particular political orientation, right? So even if in the early 19th century, we expand the collections, we get stuff from the New World, the Old World, antiquity, colonies, importantly, through very extra legal, dubious means, we are still, I mean, like Foucault put the museum, in dialogue with the archive and the prison. These are places that arbitrate discourses and that sort of present a narrative that ultimately celebrates and interprets the nation that establishes it. So in a way, it's hard to, the Louvre may have had these sort of universal ambitions that we all know, but it's also fundamentally linked to a particular conception of what it means to be French after the revolution. And France has this sort of particular conception of citizenship that is based on an interpretation of universalism, and that which of course has changed at different moments in time. But I wonder if, and I'm thinking here of, there's that amazing painting by Hubert Robert of the Grand Gallery of the Louvre. I think it's from 1796. And what we see are basically ordinary citizens looking at art in the Louvre from the period you're describing. And the sense that you get is that it's a sort of laboratory of educating citizens. So going to the museum is how you come to learn about your culture, your nation, so on and so forth. So, I mean, it has these like clear universal dimensions, but I wonder if you could tell us like what was the sort of French political connotations of the Louvre at that moment in its history, sort of toward the beginning and in the decades that followed?
Sure. Well, if I understand your question, certainly there is a continuum between the aspirations to a universal museum on the one hand, and this notion of the universal rights of man, the idea that all people are created equal and so on. In addition to that, as a logical consequence, if there's equality, everyone should have equal access to art, for example. And that was a cardinal principle of the Louvre from the moment of its creation. And that's something that you were seeing in the painting by Hubert Robert, to which you referred, where everyone, the aristocracy, the working class, the bourgeoisie, had access to the greatest paintings ever created, paintings that before that time were only in princely collections, and only the well-born, if they had references from the proper sources, would have access to it. So in that sense, there was a direct continuum between the democratic spirit of the age and the desire to give access to all people, all Frenchmen and women, to the greatest collection of the Louvre. One of the benchmarks of that was the fact that the Louvre was always open for free. You never had to pay. At various points during its history in the 1890s, for example, when they needed money, they proposed charging 1 franc admission, And this was vehemently rejected by the political class and by most intellectuals in France as being fundamentally anti-democratic, and even worse, being somehow Anglo-Saxon, because the British were famous for charging you to enter museums, which the French never did. Ironically, it's exactly the opposite now. Most of the
I was going to say,
museums
yeah.
Paris, in London are free, and you try showing your press pass in the Louvre, and you have a half-hour argument on your hands, as I know from experience. But
James, I wanted to move us into another, just a little deeper into this period of the revolution and after, because Napoleon played a huge role in the creation of the Louvre. He basically went on a shopping spree around wherever he traveled and just sort of brought home plunder for the Louvre, some of which he eventually had to give back. Where Italy was one place where he did this a lot.
This would be a good point to bring up the Veronese that you have in your image gallery there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'll do that in a sec.
Okay, so what happened was that during the French Revolution, when the armies of the French Revolution, even before Napoleon, headed into Germany, for example, in I think 1794, they started to remove some of the art from the princely collections of those potentates whom they had just conquered. And they did it with the intention of bringing the art back and putting it into the Louvre. But it didn't reach a really industrial scale until Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Italy the first time in late 1796, and then when he went into Egypt. So it was at that point that you had and then he eventually invaded the Netherlands and the various other points.
James, what are we looking at here in this picture?
Okay, so this is the Feast in the House of Levi. This is by Paolo Veronese, the great Venetian painter. It's, I forget the date, it's not like 1570 that it was completed.
1562. I just happened to know that. 1562, okay. Yeah.
Thank you, I stand corrected. And this was painted for the refectory of the Scuola of San Giorgio Maggiore in Venice.
Uh-huh. So Napoleon took this. He liked it, he took it.
Yeah, so when he entered, I guess it was originally in 1797, he reached Venice and he liked this painting and he decided that they needed it for the Louvre. And it is there to this day. It was one of hundreds, perhaps thousands of works of art, thousands in fact, that were being sent to Paris from all over Europe in the wake of Napoleon's conquest. Now, most of those were pretty promptly restored to their rightful owners in the wake of the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, when Napoleon was dispatched for good. There were, however, some works of art, and I don't quite understand the logic of this, but there were certain works of art which were considered too big or too delicate to travel. I don't understand that, because if they could move to Paris in the first place, it's hard to see why they couldn't move back. But somehow they managed to persuade the Venetians or the Italians at that point that this painting could not safely be brought back to Venice. So what they offered was an exchange, and the Venetians got the Feast in the House of Simon by Charles Lebrun, whom I consider one of the more mediocre painters in the French tradition. He had his moments, but it was hardly a fair exchange. So I still don't understand why the Italians have not agitated for the restitution of this great painting. Occasionally there are some stirrings of claims to have it restored, but it still remains in the Salle des États, right opposite the Mona Lisa.
Okay, so I'm glad you brought up the Mona Lisa, the elephant in the room, because it is obviously now the sort of main draw of the Louvre. It's so identified with the Louvre, but it wasn't always that way. How did the Mona Lisa get to be so famous?
Well, first of all, it's a great painting. So it's not as though they just hit upon any old painting and it happened to be this painting by Leonardo da Vinci. So it is a very great painting, and we would appreciate its greatness if we could still see it. But I argue in the book that that is no longer possible because it has been branded in our retinas from virtually the earliest moment when we pay any attention to visual art. So we no longer really see it in the same way we no longer see the American flag or the French flag or the dollar bill. It sort of passes before our eyes with dull indifference. But it is a great painting. We can go into why it's a great painting, but it is. Anyway, so it was Leonardo da Vinci in the 19th century was held in about as high an esteem as he is today. So any painting by Leonardo would get a lot of attention. And since it was unusually fine painting, it was admired because it was a good painting. But it didn't have that transcendent celebrity that it has now. And the process by which it acquired it was that in the early 20th century, it was stolen off the walls of the Louvre by an Italian, Vincenzo Perugia, who was a glazier. He put glass coverings on the paintings in the Louvre. And at some point he decided that he wanted the painting himself and he stole it and he kept it in a valise in a bag under his bed somewhere in Paris, I gather, for around 2 years before he was finally found out. But
he was found out because he tried to sell it to an Italian art dealer, right?
Exactly. He tried to sell it to an Italian art dealer in Florence who alerted the police, and that's how he was caught. But before that, the news of the theft was covered in newspapers across the world. And I give the analogy in the book that it was sort of like the Lindbergh baby kidnapping around 25 years later. It was, I guess it was a slow period for news. You know, this was 1911 or whatever. So they would have bigger fish to fry during the First World War. But at this point, I guess it was a fairly slow period. So they covered it every day for months on end. And it was at that point that it acquired the transcendent status that it has now.
If we could just go back to the 19th century romanticization of the painting.
Okay.
I think that that's a super interesting part of your book, and just the story in general. So you mentioned that it's a great painting, but there are other Da Vinci's and portraits of women as well that could similarly have had this sort of unbelievable celebrity. And why is it that people like Walter Pater and Théophile Gautier, et cetera, are so enamored with this particular portrait? Is it what is it about her specifically that is so captivating to that type of, and it's worth pointing out, male critic of the period?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I argue in my book is that if you were truly to see the painting, if you could somehow see with fresh eyes the way people saw it in 1870, for example, it would look very different from what we think we see now. When we look at it now, we see this four-square embodiment of beauty and truth, and it is a classic. It is a masterpiece of Western art, right? If you could see it with 19th century eyes, if you could tear away those veils, those mists of familiarity, what you would see is an extremely strange painting. And that strangeness is what captivated virtually everyone who saw it.
So what's the strangeness? What's the
Okay,
strangeness?
so the strangeness is, as I say in the book, the ordinarily portraits, old master portraits, aspire to do one thing. They generally express wealth and power in men and beauty in women, all right? So in this case, you have a portrait of a woman who is a beautiful woman. So in that sense, it conforms to the type. But no sooner have you assimilated that fact that you notice a certain sadness in her, a wry sadness in her smile. And this ambiguity perplexed viewers of the painting, I would guess, virtually from the time it was created up to 1900, let's say. Because in a general way, old master paintings try to generate a sense of the enviable condition of the sitter rather than the sadness of the sitter in a portrait. But no sooner had you assimilated that fact of her apparent sadness and her beauty, you saw, certainly Pater saw, certainly Michelet, who wrote about the painting, saw a hostility, a menacing quality to her. Pater famously refers to her as a vampire, or compares her to a vampire who had learned the secrets of the grave. Michelet famously said that he was transfixed and disturbed by her, that he went to her as the bird goes to the cobra to be devoured by it. So there is that element of menace in her countenance, which we can no longer see because we just see her as this famous masterpiece, which we should all admire. But if we could see with 19th century eyes, we would see all three of those things colliding simultaneously in a formal context, the old master portrait, which, with almost alone this exception, was created to generate one meaning alone, and usually a meaning that asserted the enviable condition of the sitter. That you should have these three things going on at once was immediately perplexing to anyone who saw it, when one could still see it with fresh eyes.
Actually, if I could just ask one question just about you know, the practice of being an art critic. You know, you just mentioned that when we see the Mona Lisa today, we see something dramatically different than what, say, a 19th century observer like Walter Pater or Michelet or any of these guys would have seen. So when you, James Gardner, go to the Louvre every day on your trips to Paris and you see the Mona Lisa, I mean, do you try to see it with 19th century eyes? And if so, how does one achieve that in the 21st century? How is it possible?
It's possible. I think I have arrived at it, but unlike most old master paintings or most works of art famous works of art that we encounter, it takes years to arrive at a condition in which one can see it, right? With the Mona Lisa, perhaps uniquely, it takes years to learn to unsee it, to tear away that familiarity and see what's underneath. I think that I have arrived at that, but I might be deluding myself. I should also say that I'm old enough, and I started going to the Louvre at a sufficiently young age, that I can remember being there early in the 1980s and even in the 70s, when you could just walk up to it and there'd be, especially if you went on a weekday towards closing time, you could walk right up to it and look as closely as you wished. I don't think that they had the bulletproof glass in front of it at the time. So you could see it much better than you can now. Nowadays, when I go to the Louvre, I tend to avoid the Mona Lisa because you really can't see anything if you're standing 60 feet back. It's one of those instances, and there are more such instances than we tend to imagine, where a photographic image will actually get you far closer to the object than actual proximity to the real thing, because as you see it now, you're looking at it through the slightly green, gray tinted
Right.
bulletproof
James,
glass.
James, speaking of the sort of more modern Louvre, I wonder if you would talk about, we're jumping ahead now, to the 80s and the decision to build the pyramid in the center of the courtyard. How did that decision come about? And as an architecture critic and an art critic, what do you make of it?
Well, I love the new Louvre. As I say, I remember what it was like before, and it's certainly far improved now in terms of the ease of use. It's far better now than it was then. There's far more that is on view. That being because the entire northern half of the Louvre has been assimilated, or almost all of it, has been assimilated to the museum, whereas before it was the Ministère des Finances that inhabited that part of the Louvre, and it was off limits to everyone.
They kicked the Ministry of Finance finally out of the Louvre. It occupied
Right.
a whole wing of it.
Exactly, yeah.
Right.
The way in which, the process by which the transformation was made was that when Mitterrand came to power in, I think, 1981, his Minister of Culture, Jacques Lang, wrote him a memo saying that we should take steps to remove the Ministry of Finance and make the whole Louvre given over to the display of art. And we should also renovate it and build various new things to accommodate the tourists. And initially, Mitterrand was skeptical, thinking that it would be too difficult to do, but eventually he signed on to it. And starting, I think, in 1983, the work began. And
did he choose the pyramid as the winning? Was there a competition to decide what should go there?
There was a competition, but pretty much Mitterrand said we're going with IMP, because he had been to the National Gallery in Washington, which Pei had done, and he liked it there. And he either knew of or had actually visited Pei's extension in in Boston, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. So he pretty much wanted IMP to do it, and that's what happened. It's interesting because you might recall that in the early 80s, it was the heyday of classical postmodernism, where architects were rediscovering the classical language of architecture. And you might think that that would be fertile territory to explore in the context of this Renaissance and 19th century Beaux-Arts structure. But Mitterrand seems never to have been interested in that. And
but do you think it works? Are you a fan?
Well, yes, the short answer is I certainly do think it works. When we say does it work, there are several parts of it. I think that what you're probably asking, do I like the pyramid? I like it very much. I think that it does not use the same vocabulary as the rest of what we see there, but it's hard to imagine, or it's hard for me to imagine, how they could have come up with a structure that would work much better and that would have the symbolic resonance of it. I don't think a classicizing structure would have worked there. It's easy to imagine that too modernist a structure would have seemed incongruous. The pyramid, the way it has a broad base and then tapers to the top, somehow works really well. And it's hard for me to imagine that if it were of a uniform volume, it would not seem obtrusive. So I do like the pyramid.
We have one of the Go ahead, Jake.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say we have a participant saying that Edith de Belleville saying it was a scandal, this pyramid. Parisians hated it, but I think that was maybe true at the beginning, but they've come to love it.
Yeah, I definitely think it was a scandal initially. My impression is that sort of like the Eiffel Tower, everyone hated it in 1889. And now most Parisians, I think, though they would never admit to actually going there, but everyone sort of associates it with Paris. I don't think anyone wants to tear it down because it's so ugly as people thought it was back in 1889. The Pyramid of the Louvre was certainly controversial, especially before it was built, when it was just in the design phase. But I think that now most people admire it. So that's one aspect of the Louvre. The other is the Hall Napoleon, which is the area into which you descend from the pyramid, which I think is very beautiful. I think it works really well.
Just one question about the modern Louvre while we're on it. So there's the pyramid, and then there's been sort of the international celebrity of the museum in the 80s, 90s to the present. But I must ask you, as somebody who's been in Paris these last couple of years, what do you make of the Jay-Z Beyonce performance at the Louvre in 2018? And what does that tell us about the future of the institution as a cultural icon?
Well, it's interesting you should bring that up. I did see I do not follow contemporary music perhaps as closely as I should.
Oh, dommage.
Right. So I would probably never have seen it were it not for the fact that when it came out, I was so bombarded with emails of people telling me to watch it because they knew I was working on the book. So I did watch it. And as far as I was concerned, as music or performance, because you cannot believe the degree to which I don't care about these things. It seemed neither worse nor better than any other video one might see. I mean, I'm sure it's good, but I didn't really care about these things. It sort of annoyed me, to the extent that I care, that it seemed as though Beyonce felt she was doing the works a favor by standing in front of them, right? Mm-hmm. So that was my reaction. But I remember when it came out, I was speaking with a young woman who was of an age where she would know and care more about these things than I do. And I said that it seemed to me as though she was trying to acquire some cultural heft or credibility by standing in front of these works in the Louvre. And the young woman told me that, in fact, it was the reverse. She was, or would be perceived by people of the young woman's generation, as conferring cultural credibility upon the Louvre.
I think that young woman was correct.
So do I.
Yeah.
I think the Louvre needs Beyonce more than Beyonce needs the Louvre, for sure.
Right.
I want to ask you about another appropriation of the Louvre's which was by Macron when was it his investiture that he held in the courtyard of the Louvre?
The night that he was declared the winner, right? Was that 2017?
May of 2017. Yeah, I was there.
Yeah, right. Oh, you were? Okay, yeah. So he staged this whole Sans Lumière production where he would march from, I don't know, some hiding place through, I think it was through the Cour Carrée, near to the pyramid or in front of the pyramid or something like that.
Yeah. Jake, what was your impression of that? Did you think it worked? Did he look like a sort of boy playing president?
I don't know. I thought that, honestly, that was the first of the kind of Macronian spectacles that I had seen. And obviously, he has a flair for the dramatic and for the visual backdrop. And what I remember most of all was that the music that he kind of processed into or around the Cour Carrée up to in front of the pyramid was the European anthem, not the Marseillaise, importantly. So it was, the Louvre as this site of, again, like returning to what we were talking about at the beginning, the sort of universal fount of culture, right? A symbol not just of France, but of Europe. And Macron, of course, loves to style himself as the president of Europe. I'm not sure anyone else in Europe agrees with that except Macron, but that was the initial ambition. And it was, I think, particularly poignant because, of course, the opponent had been Marine Le Pen, sort of the antithesis of all of that, hyper-nationalistic, hostile to the values that the Louvre is supposed to represent in some ways. So I remember it being kind of staged and powerful, but also superficial at the same time. Like it was sort of was a little too much on the nose, in my à mon avis.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, let me say, apropos of Macron's coronation, if you will, in the at the Louvre, it does emphasize the role that the Louvre has often been asked to play in French culture as the center of cultural Frenchness, right? France as the seat of high culture, France as the custodian of high culture, the guarantor of high culture. And we didn't mention this earlier, but it's important to understand that the Louvre sits precisely in the center of Paris. Almost, if you were to measure the périphérique and Paris, you would see that it was directly in the center of Paris. And Paris is the center of France, and France is, as we all know, the center of the world. So the Louvre is the center of the world. And so for Macron to submit to his coronation in front of the Pyramide is merely a reinforcement of that. It tugs, as we would say here, upon the mystic chords of memory of the French. And there seemed to be, I guess, an appropriateness